Now, given the current pandemic, it may seem more than a little strange to be thinking about exhibitions, but equally everything I'm about to share in this video is suitable for both home and exhibition layouts. And equally, I've been thinking about my next layout and what it will be. But before I've even got to the construction stage, I'm thinking about lighting. Now, in actual fact, it's really important to think about lighting from the outset. And indeed, it's best to have your lighting rig set up and running before you even do all the scenery, because the scenery will change according to the light that is shone across it. So why do I think that lighting is the most important aspect when it comes to model railways? If you think about exhibiting or operating a layout as some kind of theatrical performance, you can have the best performance in the world, but if your audience can't see it, well, then what's the point? And indeed, a mediocre layout that has really good lighting will look far better than even a very high quality layout with poor or no lighting at all. But don't worry, because I'm here to help give you some advice and pointers about layout lighting, and hopefully by the end of this video there'll be enough here to help you see the light. Now, despite my earlier reference to theatrical performances, you want to avoid any sort of spotlight when it comes to lighting up your model railway, and the simple reason is that you want a well lit and evenly lit scene across the entire layout. And this of course includes incandescent, energy saving bulbs, halogens, or any kind of spotty light. For a spotlight to work, it needs distance, high brightness and soft diffusion to light up the entire scene evenly. However, this just isn't practical either at home or at exhibitions. Fluorescent strips do cast a nice even light due to their long tube-like nature, however most are inefficient, usually not terribly bright, and tend to cast a yellowish light. Perhaps most importantly, they are fragile, so definitely ill-suited for exhibition layouts. So that leaves us with the obvious choice, the LED strip or tape. Now, it's long-lasting, versatile, and more importantly, it's safer to use than any of the alternatives. So throughout the rest of this video, we will be talking exclusively about 12-volt LED tapes, due to them being cost-effective, easy to use, and widely available. But before we go any further, it's important to note that you should never buy RGB LEDs for anything other than mood lighting in a room. Having all the colours in the world will not mean you will get a satisfactory, natural looking colour, quite the opposite in fact. They also tend not to be as bright as single colour LEDs. So with that out of the way, we now need to consider a variety of other aspects. Firstly is the lighting setup that we intend to build. For example, look at the sketch on the screen now. We've got 3 runs of lighting, one at the front, one in the middle, and one at the rear to give us a nice even spread. 2 of which are 1 metre long, and the other is 1.5 metres long. So that means we need 3.5 metres of LED tape. Now most LED tapes come in 5 metre reels, because that tends to be the maximum length that you can wire up in series, i.e. in one long length. If you need over 5 metres of LED tape for your layout, you have to wire in parallel in order to ensure that all the LEDs are lit evenly, and that you don't cause too much current to enter and thus damage the strip itself. The next stage is to decide on the specifics of the LED tape. Now there are quite a few varieties, so we need to figure out exactly what colour temperature we want. And the colour temperature of LEDs ranges from about 2700 kelvins, which is a warm white, so somewhat yellow, to about 6500 kelvins, which is essentially daylight. In interior settings, however, that would be a pretty cold colour, and is likely to look blue. Broadly speaking, I would therefore stay between 4000 and 5000 kelvins. Something becoming very popular is actually to combine different temperature tapes, usually 2 cooler tapes next to 1 warm tape, and that just gives a little bit of tonal variety. Next, we need to consider high or low density tapes, and this just means how many LEDs you get per metre of tape. Standard density is around 30, whereas high density will give you about 60 LEDs a metre. Therefore, I recommend high density lights for 2 reasons. 1, you have a brighter output, and 2, having the LEDs closer together will reduce any weird dark spots or shadows. The third stage is to consider the driver and whether you need a constant current or constant voltage. It is really important to make sure you use the right type of driver, because using the wrong type can cause irreparable damage. You also need to consider whether you want one or more than one driver, and this will depend on your chosen setup. If you have 5 meters or less of LED tape, a single driver is sufficient, and even for multiple reels you can still use one large driver if you wire in parallel. Alternatively, you can separate each reel and run each off of its own driver. And now comes the most important point about drivers. You will need to buy a driver that has enough power to cope with the load that you're putting on it. Don't worry, because this is really easy to calculate. Simply take the length of tape in meters, multiply it by the watts per meter of the LED tape, and add a 20% headroom. That will give you the minimum power of the driver that you need to run that setup. And it's important to note that you can use a driver capable of outputting more power than the setup needs, as the tape will only pull the power it needs. However, you cannot run the system at or below the minimum power, and that's why we allow a 20% headroom. It also ensures that the driver is not at maximum capacity all the time, and thus will prolong not only its life, but the LED tape's life as well. And finally, we need to look at the extra components. Now, depending on the brightness of the LED chips and tape that you're using, you may want to consider using some dimmable drivers. Most of these come in the form of 1 to 10 volt dimmers, but you can get other choices. Either way, you must make sure that the driver is indeed dimmable, because not all of them are. You also need to obviously buy a dimmable controller as well, and you'll need to make sure that this controller can cope with the load that you impose upon it. Now, there are a few ways of attaching LED tape to your layout. You can of course simply directly attach it with a sticky tape to the wooden supports, or you can do what I do and use some aluminium extrusion. Now, I like this method for 2 reasons. 1, because the aluminium acts as a heat sink, and 2, because it's nice and lightweight. These aluminium extrusions also tend to come with brackets and diffusers, which, as we'll mention later on, is a really useful thing to have. The only time it may be an issue is when you want to do curved fascias, and in that situation I would simply attach it directly to the wood. Now, there are a couple of options to connect the LED tapes together. You can purchase clip-on connectors that come in a variety of styles, and these simply clip into the existing solder points on the end of the tape. However, what I prefer to do is use these 2.1mm jacks. You can also use any other sort of typical electronic connector, things like D-pins or 5-pin connectors, but I find the simplest way of doing it is simply with 2.1mm jacks. Now, I like these because not only are they super cheap and super versatile, but they have these screw connectors on the ends, and that means it's really easy to wire up each rig. Finally, it's worth talking briefly about wires. And even when we're looking at low voltage systems like 12 volt lighting, keeping things safe is crucial, and we must ensure that the wire is of sufficient gauge to safely carry the current and voltage. Thankfully, there are plenty of free calculators and tables online that you can use to work out the correct gauge. On a basic level, you need to find the current that will run through that section of wire by dividing the power of the tape connected to it by the voltage of the tape. In the example here, we can see that 12 volt tape that has an output power of 60 watts will need a wire capable of handling at least 5 amps. And looking at the table on its right, we can see that the smallest suitable gauge is 22. The smaller the gauge, the larger the wire, and the more current it can handle. Just like the drivers, firstly, you can always use a wire rated for a higher load than is put through it, and secondly, it's good practice to add a little bit of headroom, so that we don't run everything at full capacity all the time. But just be wary that thicker wires will be slightly harder to solder and less flexible. So in summary, we've learned that it's best to use 12 volt high density LED tapes of between 4000 to 5000 kelvins for a nice bright and natural looking colour. We've also learned that we need to determine the length of LED tape needed and how we plan to set it up, in order to find the minimum driver power needed, and we use that information to help us decide the correct type and power of driver. We've also given consideration to how we plan to attach the LED tape and what to use to connect it all up together. And finally, we've also learned that we need to determine the correct gauge of wire to make sure our setup is safe. Whilst I've made every effort to ensure I presented you with correct advice, do ask LED suppliers or an electrician if you are unsure of any of the technical aspects. So now we've looked at the types of lighting available, we can go ahead and think about how we're going to construct a lighting rig for our layout. Now the type of lighting rig you want to use will depend on a number of factors. So we've got the size of the layout, the length of the layout, the situation that the layout will be in, so whether it will be home or exhibition or a bit of both, and just various other factors. So I'm not going to be able to touch on everything in this video, but I'm going to give you a few designs that are quite similar to one another, but should allow you to have some ideas for something that you can use for your layout. Now, all the lighting rigs I'm about to show you use the same materials. So we've got some 3mm ply, some 6mm ply, some 9mm ply, and also some 32 by 32mm PSC softwood, where you can use any similar size that you can find. I'm also going to be using some 6mm dowels to make sure that we can make some really strong joints. Other than that, it's just a simple case of using a few screws and some wood glue. So we're really not trying to do anything too complicated here, just using the very basic necessities in order to make a good lighting rig. And in fact, tools wise, we don't even need anything special either. Simply a mechanical pencil, a steel rule, a measuring tape, a saw, and maybe a battery drill and things like that. So we really don't need to have any complicated machinery. Although if you're like me and you simply just cannot cut wood straight to save your life, then a compound miter saw or some sort of circular saw will probably come in handy. So let's go ahead and have a look at some really simple lighting rigs. Okay, so on screen now we have our 5 lighting rigs plus an extra one. I'm going to show them to you each in turn and explain how simple they are to build and why they work as a design. Okay, so first up we have this, which is a permanent lighting rig on a cameo layout. Now cameo layouts are basically small layouts that are self-contained, usually on one board, although can be a multiple, and I just wanted to show you that you could make a really simple permanent setup with the basic materials. And as you can see, I've surrounded the layout in 3 or 6mm ply sheets, and that gives us a nice solid foundation to build our lighting rig on top of. Equally, you can see that we've got some of the PSE here, the softwood. This is 32 by 32, but typically you tend to find it's more in the region of 34 by 34mm softwood. And another thing to note is that you'll see that I've extended it over the front of the layout by about 2 inches or 50mm. And that's to make sure we don't get any shadows on the front of buildings or trees or other tall structures at the front of the layout. If you were to keep your lighting rig flush, you would have these areas not lit up at all at the front. So it's really important for every single layout that you make sure you extend that rig over the front. Now to attach the LED lighting to the layouts, we're going to be using some aluminium extrusion throughout all of the designs that I'm about to show you. And indeed here we've got 2 different types. We have some L-shaped sort of 45-degree angle extrusion here on the front behind the fascia, and that helps to give some nice light not only at the front of the layout but also towards the middle and rear. Elsewhere on the layout we have the U-shaped extrusion, and these are all available in between sort of ½ meter, 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meter lengths, and don't forget you can always trim these down with a hacksaw. Something really useful about this sort of thing is that these are often available in multi-packs, and they also come with their own brackets and also diffusers. Now these little thin diffusers that go inside the aluminium extrusion are really useful because not only do they diffuse the light obviously, so they make it a lot softer and get rid of harsh shadows, but they also have another effect. Now with LED tapes like you see here, because the lights are so tightly spaced together, you tend to get a weird sort of shimmering effect on top of the railheads. Now in order to eliminate that, we can use the diffusers to help spread that light a little bit more, and it tends to get rid of that awkward shine. Now on this particular design, I've attached the aluminium extrusion to some 9mm ply. However, you can equally do it on something like PSE, so perhaps some 18mm thick PSE would be equally sufficient. As this is a permanent setup, we're just going to be gluing and screwing them in place. So overall that's just a really simple design and one that you can easily make in an afternoon. And it's perfect for both small home or exhibition layouts. Next we have a lighting rig which is detachable. The uprights are held into place with some metal brackets. and we also have a 6 or 9mm ply stopper underneath to make sure you have the rig at the right height. Don't worry if you can't find any metal brackets like this, because I'll show you an alternative way of doing it that doesn't need any hardware in the next rig. Regardless, we've obviously got the frame made of 32mm PSE, but on this one I've added some 6 or 9mm plywood flanges onto the outsides of the frame, and that provides a lot more strength and stability, which is important for something that's cantilevered like this. Now the rig actually breaks down into more than one component, and as we can see, if I zoom in on this bit, we have the fascia, which is an entirely separate group. And here we've got a really simple way of attaching it via some homemade 3mm plywood brackets, and these are just really simple to make. This basically means that you can lift off the whole fascia without needing to undo any screws or fiddle with any sort of hardware. But it's not just the fascia that can be removed, and we can also remove any of the additional lighting strips. So for this we've got some 9mm ply again, but again you can use any sort of PSE that you want. And to attach this, I've simply made holes in the arm, and I put some 6mm dowel glued into the 9mm ply. If I lift this up, you can see it's just a simple case of dropping it into the hole. So that basically means you can remove every single thing. So you can remove facer, remove 2 lights, and of course these 2 arms just lift up as well out the brackets. So this is particularly ideal for a small portable explicit lamp. So let's move on to the third rig. Now this is my favourite design because it's the one I use on my layout, Sandy Shores, and it's also really simple and versatile. Now the basic premise is we just have 3 arms and legs that are L-shaped, so similar to the one previously, but this time the 3 arms are all hinged together with standard door hinges. Now this is a really versatile rig because not only can you use it for the straight rectangular boards, but it's also really easy to adapt it for use on boards with a curved shape. Now the fascia is exactly the same as the previous rig, so it just simply lifts off with those 3mm ply homemade brackets. But we also need to find a way of removing the lights. So this time I've gone with a similar method of brackets, but this time we've just got 2 L shapes and they are pinned together with gravity basically. Now because the 3 arms fold flat, we want some way of having some sort of movable system here so we can make sure these orient with the arms themselves. So to that end I've just drilled a 4mm hole in the brackets and stuck an M4 bolt through the top. And that means we can basically rotate these brackets like so, just to match the arm. As you can imagine, it makes a really simple setup. So again, like the fascia, we just slide the lights right in. Now I mentioned earlier about what to do if you can't find any of those awkward wooden brackets. So this is the system I use on my layout, and it's really simple. So we've got the whole rig itself here, and all we need to do is make sure the left and rightmost posts sit on top of the board, but the middle post slides into a hole in the baseboard. So if we look here, we've got more 32mm PSE just to form the hole with a stopper at the bottom. Now like I said, obviously this all folds flat, so it's a very versatile system, not only for straight boards, but also for boards that are curved. Now as you can see, the curved version is almost exactly the same with only a few minor changes. The first change is to alter the angle of the cut on the outermost arms, and that helps us form the curve of the fascia. Now obviously we can't have aluminium extrusion on here because it won't bend like that, so for this I've gone for some heat resistant velcro, and that just means I can tear off the LED strip when it comes to disassembling the whole unit. Now to make sure I adequately light up the whole layout, I've added some extra strips here. Now don't worry though, because these short ones can share the same wooden bracket here, so it really doesn't matter, and it makes for a really versatile little setup. Now like I said, this is my favourite design just because of how easy it is to make. You don't need many tools, you don't need any hardware apart from the hinges, and it's just a very versatile little setup. Now this fourth design is really simple, and it's basically inspired by something that Giles Pavel wrote in the spring issue of BRM 2020. Basically, this is pretty much the same as the first rig, however without the sides for reasons that I'll explain in a minute, and instead of a permanent rig, we've got one that actually slides out using some small jaw runners. Now you can find these easily online, they're not really hard to find and they're very cheap. The basic premise is that it gives you just that little bit extra room for when you want to store the layout. Then when you want to operate the layout or take it to the next person, you can simply extend the rig. And one thing I'll do is I'll just explain the reason for not adding the sides. And that is so I can show you just how easy it would be to add another rig onto another board. And there we have it, we've doubled it. And we've got the whole LED lights all nicely set up, and these are all removable using the dowel method I showed earlier. So yeah, nice simple design, and it's just perfect if you want to get that little bit more extra space when you're putting the layout into storage. Now the fifth design is one I haven't tested, however it's something that I came up with in order to get a minimum footprint for portability in mind. Now the idea is that instead of having some rigid L-frame supports, these actually hinge in the middle. And as you can see, I put some 6 or 9mm ply on the outside just to give that extra bit more room to screw the hinges on. I've also gone for a slightly different method of attaching the LED strip. Here we have yet more PLC, and I've simply just rebaited it into the arms, as you can see. We also have a hole there for wiring, just to make it a little easier to run cables from one run to the next. Now as this is in its own trough, we don't need to worry about gluing it in place with dowels or anything like that. However, for the front one we will. And the basic idea is that the fascia and the first run of lighting comes off in one go, and again it's kind of held in place by the 6mm dowels in the holes. So basically that means we can remove a lot of the components. So if we remove the fascia and first bit of lighting, we'll remove the middle and or rear one. And if I turn the camera around, we can just fold this section in half, and we'll just fold it by 180 degrees. And there we go, we have a nice flat pack rig. And obviously this whole thing lifts out of the baseboard just like the previous design. But yeah, overall it's quite a simple design actually, and I'm hoping it will save a lot of space when transporting the layout. So those are just 5 really simple lighting rig designs, and of course like I said earlier, there's many ways of doing it, and it also depends on your type of layout, the size, etc, etc. Whether you're building a home or an exhibition layout, there should be something in there that will help you design your rig for your layout. I often find that the easiest way is to keep the materials light, so you want 3mm, 6mm ply, softwood, that sort of thing. You don't need anything complicated like metal brackets and metal stanchions and really heavy things like that. Thanks to the lightweight nature of LED and the aluminium extrusion, usually something like softwood will be plenty good enough for LED installations. And don't miss my next video where I'll be using these exact same features to design and build my very own mini lighting rig for a diorama. And in the meantime, do leave any questions or comments down below and I'll try and get back to you.